The autumn wind swept across the Wyoming plains like a blade, cutting through the brittle grass that stretched endlessly toward mountains still capped with early snow. Sarah Jenkins stood on her sagging porch, coffee growing cold in her weathered hands, watching the sun break reluctantly over Clay Vance's sprawling ranch to the east. 3 years had passed since Jack's heart gave out in that same field she was staring at now, and in those 3 years, the farm had slowly been dying with her will to keep it alive. The fence posts leaned at drunken angles. The barn's red paint had surrendered to the elements, leaving behind silvered wood that groaned in the wind. Most of the cattle were gone, sold off one by one to pay debts and taxes. What remained was Scout, her blue heeler cattle dog, and a stubborn refusal to let Clay Vance have the satisfaction of watching her fail completely. Sarah was 58 years old, though the mirror sometimes showed her a woman 10 years older. Her hands were rope-scarred and calloused, her face lined by sun and sorrow. She wore her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, the same way she'd worn it since she was a girl. Jack used to tease her about it, said she looked like a schoolmarm fixing to rap knuckles with a ruler. The memory of his laugh was fading now, worn thin like an old photograph handled too many times. Scout's sudden bark pulled her from her thoughts. The dog stood rigid at the edge of the property, staring toward Vance's land with an intensity Sarah had learned to respect. Scout was getting old himself, his muzzle graying, but his instincts remained sharp as barbed wire. "What is it, boy?" Sarah set down her coffee and walked to where Scout stood trembling, not with fear, but with what looked almost like grief. That's when she saw it. On Vance's side of the fence line, perhaps 200 yards away, a horse stood alone in a muddy pen. Even from this distance, Sarah could see the animal's ribs pressing against its dull coat like prison bars. But it wasn't the emaciation that made her stomach turn. It was the way the horse held its head, tilted slightly, moving in small, uncertain circles while a rope halter kept it tethered to a post in the center of the pen. As Sarah watched, one of Vance's ranch hands, a thick-necked man she recognized as Cutter, approached the horse with a bucket. The horse shied away, crashing into the fence it couldn't see, and Cutter laughed. He set down the bucket and picked up a stick instead, poking at the terrified animal, forcing it to move this way and that like some cruel puppet show. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She'd heard rumors that Vance had a blind horse, worked it until it couldn't work anymore, and then discarded it like a broken tool. Seeing the reality of it was something else entirely. Scout whined, a sound Sarah had never heard from him before. It was a sound of pure empathy, of one creature recognizing the suffering of another. "I know," Sarah whispered, her hand finding the dog's head. "I know, boy." She watched until Cutter grew bored and walked away, leaving the blind horse alone in its pen, trembling and lost. Then she turned back to her own deteriorating homestead, feeling the weight of helplessness settle on her shoulders like winter snow. What could she do? The horse belonged to Vance, and Vance owned half the county, or might as well have. He had the sheriff in his pocket, the town council too. A widow with a failing farm had no voice against a man like that. But Scout had other ideas. The next morning, Sarah woke to find the dog gone. She called for him, panic rising. Scout never wandered, never left her side without permission. She found him an hour later at the fence line, lying in the dirt as close to Vance's property as he could get without crossing over. And on the other side of that fence, just a few feet away, the blind horse stood perfectly still, its head lowered towards Scout's position. "Scout, come," Sarah commanded, but the dog didn't move. His tail thumped once against the ground, but he stayed where he was, and the horse stayed too, and Sarah realized she was witnessing something she couldn't name. The horse's ears were pricked forward, focused entirely on Scout's location. Its nostrils flared, taking in the dog's scent. And slowly, carefully, the blind horse took one step toward the fence, then another, moving with more purpose than Sarah had seen in it before. Scout made a soft sound, not quite a whine, not quite a bark. The horse's ears swiveled toward it. Another step. The rope halter stretched taut, stopping the horse a few feet from the fence, but it didn't matter. Some connection had been made. Some invisible thread stretched between the abandoned dog who'd lost his purpose when the cattle were sold, and the broken horse who'd lost its sight to Vance's greed. Sarah stood watching them for a long time, these two discarded creatures finding solace in each other across a boundary of wire and wood. Finally, she turned back to her house, leaving Scout to his vigil. If this was what he needed, she wouldn't deny him. God knew they'd both been lonely long enough. The pattern repeated itself daily. Each morning, Scout would make his pilgrimage to the fence line and settle in the dust. The blind horse would orient itself toward the dog's position, sometimes standing for hours in companionable silence, sometimes moving restlessly in its limited circle while Scout made gentle sounds to guide it. The horse learned the topography of its prison through Scout's patient coaching, where the water bucket sat, where the fence line ran, where to step to avoid the deepest mud. Sarah watched Vance's ranch hands notice the strange friendship. Most ignored it, but Cutter seemed irritated by it, as if Scout's kindness was some kind of personal insult. He started timing his visits to the pen when Scout was there, making loud noises to startle the horse, laughing when it crashed into things. One afternoon, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She walked to the fence line and called out across Vance's property. "You got a problem with my dog, Cutter?" The ranch hand turned, surprise flickering across his face before settling into a sneer. "You're much trespassing, Mrs. Jenkins. Might have to do something about that. He's on my side of the fence." "Barely." Cutter spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Besides, he's bothering Mr. Vance's property." "That horse looks like it could use some bothering," Sarah said, her voice hard as iron. "Looks like it could use some feeding too. And some veterinary care. You people planning to let it starve to death out here? Or you got plans to put it down yourselves?" Cutter's face darkened. "What Mr. Vance does with his animals ain't none of your concern, lady. You got your own problems to worry about." His gaze swept over her sagging fences and peeling barn with deliberate scorn. "Place is falling apart. Shame to see what you done to Jack's legacy." The words hit their mark, as they were meant to. Sarah felt her face burn, but she held her ground. "Get away from that horse, Cutter. And if I see you tormenting it again, we're going to have a problem." "That a threat?" Cutter took a step toward the fence, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. It was just for show. He wouldn't draw on a woman in broad daylight, but the message was clear enough. Scout growled, low and dangerous, his hackles rising. On the other side of the fence, the blind horse shuffled backward, frightened by the sudden tension in the air. Sarah stood her ground, meeting Cutter's eyes with a stare that had faced down blizzards and droughts and the death of everything she'd loved. "It's a promise," she said quietly. "Now get." For a moment, Cutter looked like he might push it further. Then he laughed, shook his head, and walked away. But Sarah knew this wasn't over. She'd made an enemy today, and enemies of Clay Vance had a way of losing their land, their livelihoods, or worse. That night, lying in the bed she'd once shared with Jack, Sarah listened to the wind howl around the house and wondered what the hell she was doing. That horse wasn't her problem. She had enough troubles of her own without adding a blind animal and a vindictive ranch hand to the list. The smart thing would be to call Scout back, keep him close to home, let nature take its course with Vance's horse. But when morning came and Scout was already gone to the fence line before she woke, Sarah knew she wouldn't call him back. Because Scout had found something out there that he'd lost when Jack died and the farm started failing. A purpose, a creature that needed him. And maybe, Sarah thought as she made her coffee and watched the sun rise, maybe she understood that better than she wanted to admit. The weather turned violent on a Tuesday in late October. Sarah had watched the clouds build all day, towering thunderheads stacking themselves against the mountains like granite pillars. By evening, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, yellow-green and sickly, and the wind that came before the storm carried the smell of rain and electricity. Sarah moved through her evening chores with practiced efficiency, battening down what needed battening, bringing in what needed bringing in. The chickens she still kept huddled nervously in their coop. The old barn groaned and creaked, and Sarah made a mental note of which boards needed replacing, knowing she probably couldn't afford the lumber anyway. Scout was agitated, pacing between the house and the fence line. He'd come when she called him in for dinner, but he barely touched his food, instead standing at the door and whining. "Storm's coming, boy," Sarah told him. "That horse will be fine. Probably safer in that pen than we are in this old house." But Scout knew something she didn't, or maybe he just cared more than logic allowed. When the first fat raindrops began to fall, he scratched at the door until Sarah, against her better judgment, let him out. "You stubborn fool. she called after him as he disappeared into the gathering darkness. Just like your master was. The storm hit with the fury that only high plains storms can muster. Thunder cracked like artillery fire, close enough to rattle the windows. Lightning turned night to day in stuttering flashes that left afterimages burned on Sarah's retinas. She stood at her kitchen window, trying to spot Scout in the chaos, but the rain fell so thick it was like looking through a waterfall. And then, in one brilliant flash of lightning, she saw them. Scout was at the fence line, but he wasn't alone. The blind horse had broken free somehow. The rope must have snapped in its panic, and it was thrashing wildly in the mud, completely disoriented, crashing into fence posts and stumbling in holes it couldn't see. Each thunderclap sent it into fresh terror, spinning and rearing, and Sarah knew with sick certainty that it was going to kill itself out there, break a leg or run itself into a fence post hard enough to snap its neck. She grabbed her rain slicker and a flashlight and ran out into the storm. The rain hit her like a physical force, soaking through her clothes in seconds. The wind tore at her, trying to push her back toward the house. But Sarah had been born in Wyoming, had weathered worse than this, and she pushed forward through the mud and the chaos toward the fence line. When she got there, she understood what Scout was trying to do. The dog had positioned himself between the panicked horse and Vance's fence, and he was making a sound Sarah had never heard before, a low, rhythmic vocalization, almost like singing. Not barking, not whining, but something else, something soothing and constant beneath the fury of the storm. And somehow, impossibly, the blind horse was listening. Its head was lowered, ears swiveling toward Scout's voice. It was still trembling, still frightened, but it had stopped its wild thrashing. Scout moved, and the horse tracked the movement through sound and scent alone. The dog took a step toward Sarah's property, toward the gap in the fence she'd been meaning to fix for months, and the horse followed. Sarah held her breath. Another step. Another. Scout was leading the blind horse like a shepherd leading a lamb, patient and gentle and absolutely fearless in the face of the storm. The lightning flashed again, and the horse shied, but Scout was there immediately, pressing against its legs, making that strange singing sound, and the horse steadied. They reached the gap in the fence. It was barely wide enough for the horse to fit through, and on the other side was Sarah's property, her responsibility, her liability if anything went wrong. Legally, this was theft. Vance could press charges, could have her arrested, could use this as an excuse to finally take her land. Sarah didn't hesitate. She widened the gap in the fence with her bare hands, ignoring the bite of barbed wire into her palms, and Scout guided the blind horse through. On her property now, the horse seemed to calm slightly, as if it could sense the change in circumstance, the shift from abandonment to sanctuary. Scout led it toward the barn, that old structure that was falling apart, but was at least dry and safe from the storm. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, but Sarah managed to wrestle it open, and Scout guided the horse inside. The relief was immediate. The sound of rain on the tin roof was loud but steady, not frightening like the thunder. The barn smelled of old hay and weathered wood, familiar smells that spoke of shelter and safety. The horse stood in the center of the barn, sides heaving, covered in mud and blood from a dozen scrapes and cuts, but alive. Scout collapsed in the straw, exhausted from his efforts. Sarah stood there dripping and bleeding from her torn hands, staring at the blind horse she'd just stolen from the most powerful man in the county, and she started to laugh. It was a slightly hysterical sound, but it felt good, felt like something breaking loose inside her that had been locked down since Jack died. "What the hell did you get me into, Scout?" she asked the dog, but Scout just thumped his tail against the ground, utterly pleased with himself. Sarah spent the next hour tending to the horse by lantern light while the storm raged outside. She found an old blanket and dried the animal as best she could, then checked its injuries. Mostly superficial cuts and scrapes, nothing that looked infected or too deep. The horse accepted her ministrations with a quiet patience that spoke of exhaustion more than trust. Up close, she could see the cloudiness in its eyes, the milky white that meant total blindness. She could also see the scars on its flanks, its shoulders, its face. This horse had been worked hard and treated worse. Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the same anger she'd felt watching Cutter tormented, the same anger she'd been carrying for 3 years at a world that took good men like Jack and left bastards like Clay Vance to prosper. You got a name? She asked the horse, knowing it didn't, knowing Vance wouldn't have bothered. Well, you do now. I'm calling you Chance. Because that's what Scout just gave you, a second chance. Chance's ear swiveled toward her voice. Its head lowered slightly, and for just a moment, it seemed almost peaceful. Sarah left the barn as the storm began to abate, Scout padding faithfully at her heels. She stood in her muddy yard and looked toward Vance's ranch, where lights were beginning to come on in the big house on the hill. Morning would come soon, and with it would come consequences. Vance would notice his horse was gone. He'd follow the trail to her barn, and then there would be hell to pay. But for tonight, a blind horse named Chance was warm and dry and safe. And that, Sarah decided, was enough. Dawn broke gray and sullen over the plains, the storm's fury spent, but its memory lingering in standing water and broken branches. Sarah hadn't slept. She'd spent the night sitting on her porch with Jack's old Winchester rifle across her lap, watching Vance's ranch for signs of movement. Scout lay at her feet, equally vigilant, occasionally lifting his head to listen to sounds only he could hear. The horse, Chance, had settled well enough in the barn. Sarah had checked on him twice during the night, bringing water and some of the hay she'd been saving for winter. The animal was skittish at first, startling at every unfamiliar sound, but Scout's presence seemed to calm him. The dog had appointed himself Chance's guardian, and Sarah wasn't about to argue with that arrangement. They came at 8 in the morning. Sarah heard them before she saw them. The rumble of a diesel truck, the sound of men's voices carrying across the still morning air. She stood slowly, her back protesting after a night in the porch chair, and checked that the Winchester was loaded. It was a bluff, mostly. She had no intention of actually shooting anyone, but Vance and his men didn't need to know that. The truck pulled up to her property line and stopped. 3 men got out. Clay Vance himself led them, a tall man in his early 60s who still carried himself like the rodeo champion he'd been 40 years ago. He wore an expensive Stetson and hand-tooled boots that probably cost more than Sarah's truck. Flanking him were Cutter and another ranch hand Sarah recognized as Tommy Birch, both armed with pistols on their hips. Vance stopped at the edge of Sarah's property, making a show of respecting the boundary, though they both knew respect had nothing to do with it. This was theater, a performance for any witnesses who might be watching. "Morning, Sarah," Vance called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Hell of a storm last night." "Was indeed," Sarah replied, not moving from her porch. The Winchester rested in the crook of her arm, casual but unmistakable. "Seems I'm missing a horse. Blind gelding, not worth much, but it's the principle of the thing. You wouldn't happen to have seen it, would you?" "Might have." Vance's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Well now, if you did see it, I'd appreciate you returning my property. Horse needs to be put down anyway. It's suffering, can't work, can't do nothing but stand around and eat feed. Most humane thing is a bullet." "Horse seems fine to me," Sarah said. "Scared and underfed, but fine. That horse is on my books, bought and paid for. What I do with it is my business. Horse is in my barn now. That makes it my business." The false friendliness dropped from Vance's face like a discarded mask. "Now you listen here, Sarah. I've been patient with you. Let you keep this falling down excuse for a ranch when I could have bought you out a dozen times. I've been respectful of Jack's memory, God rest him. But theft is theft, and I won't stand for it." "Theft?" Sarah's voice hardened. "That horse walked onto my property of its own accord. Fence was down from the storm. If you want to press charges, go ahead and try. We'll see what Judge Morrison thinks about a man who starves animals and works them blind." Cutter took a step forward, his hand moving toward his pistol, but Vance held up a hand to stop him. The rancher's eyes were fixed on Sarah, calculating, measuring how far he could push before something broke. "You're making a mistake," Vance said quietly. "This isn't about a worthless horse. This is about respect, about understanding how things work around here. I own this valley, Sarah. I own the feed store, the equipment rentals, the hands who do day labor. You cross me, you'll find yourself without help when you need it, without credit when you need it, without friends when you need them most." "I don't have much of any of that already," Sarah said. "So I guess I don't have much to lose." "Everyone's got something to lose," Vance said, and there was genuine menace in his voice now. "That old barn looks dry as tinder. Be a shame if a spark from somewhere." He didn't get to finish the threat. Scout had risen to his feet and was growling, a sound that started deep in his chest and rolled out like distant thunder. And from the barn came an answering sound. Chance, frightened by the raised voices, calling out in distress. The sound broke something in Sarah. All the grief and anger and loneliness of the past 3 years crystallized into a single, burning point of clarity. This was the line. This was where she chose to stand or fall. She raised the Winchester and pointed it at the sky, not at Vance, but the message was clear enough. You want that horse, you're going to have to come through me to get him. And I guarantee you, that'll make more headlines than you want. Rich rancher shoots widow over blind horse. Wonder how that'll play in town. Vance's face flushed red. His hand moved toward his own gun, and for a moment Sarah thought he might actually do it, might actually be stupid and angry enough to draw on her. Cutter and Tommy both had their hands on their pistols now, and the morning air felt stretched tight as a drumhead, ready to split at the slightest pressure. Then, cutting through the tension like a knife, came the sound of another vehicle approaching. An old pickup truck, blue paint faded to gray, pulled up behind Vance's vehicle. Out stepped Martha Higgins, the 70-something owner of the town's general store. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had the presence of a thunderstorm and the mouth to match. What's all this about? Martha called out, marching forward without the slightest concern for the armed standoff she was interrupting. Clay Vance, you better not be threatening Sarah Jenkins. Vance turned, clearly irritated by the interruption. This is private business, Martha. Private business, my ass, Martha shot back. I heard you were down here making trouble over that poor blind horse you've been starving to death. Half the town heard about it. I don't know what lies you've been listening to. Lies. Martha's voice could have cut steel. I got eyes, don't I? Been watching that horse waste away in your pen for months. Everyone in town's been watching it. Just nobody had the guts to say anything until now. Another vehicle was approaching. Old Tom's ancient flatbed, rattling and squeaking. The farmer pulled up and got out slowly, favoring his bad hip. Tom was in his 50s, weathered and worn, and he'd lost his own ranch to Vance's maneuvering 5 years back. Now he worked odd jobs and drank too much, but there was something different in his eyes this morning, something that looked almost like hope. Heard there might be trouble, Tom said simply, moving to stand next to Martha. Vance looked between them, his face darkening further. This doesn't concern you people. Seems to me it concerns everyone, Martha said. You've been pushing folks around in this valley for 20 years, Clay Vance. Taking land, squeezing people out, buying off the sheriff. Well, maybe that stops today. More vehicles were arriving now. Sarah couldn't believe it. Pete Morales, who ran the feed store. The Johnson brothers, who farmed the section north of town. Mary Chun from the diner. Even young Danny Weaver, just 16, who worked afternoons at the hardware store. They pulled up in their trucks and old cars, getting out and forming a loose line between Vance and Sarah's porch. Sarah's throat tightened. These people, most of whom she barely knew, some of whom she'd never even spoken to, had come. They'd heard somehow, probably through Martha's information network, and they'd come. Vance looked around at the gathering crowd, and Sarah saw something in his face she'd never seen before, uncertainty. His power in this valley rested on fear and isolation, on picking off his opponents one by one. But faced with a community that was finally standing together, even his considerable influence had limits. This isn't over, Vance said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. That horse is my property, and I'll have it back, one way or another. Try it, Martha said flatly, and every newspaper in the state will hear about it. I got a cousin works for the Gazette in Casper. Would love to write a story about how Wyoming's big ranchers treat their animals. Vance stared at her, then at Sarah, then at the assembled townspeople. His hand flexed near his gun, and Sarah knew he was weighing his options, calculating whether violence would solve his problem or create a bigger one. Finally, with visible effort, he stepped back. Keep the damn horse, he spat. It's worthless anyway. But you remember this, Sarah Jenkins. You remember who tried to help you and who stood against you. Because that memory's going to matter when winter comes and you need credit, when your roof caves in and you need hands, when you're freezing and starving and there's nobody left to care. He turned and stalked back to his truck, Cutter and Tommy following. The diesel engine roared to life, and they pulled away in a spray of gravel and mud, leaving deep ruts in Sarah's driveway. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah stood on her porch, the Winchester still in her hands, hardly believing what had just happened. These people, strangers, mostly, had stood up to Clay Vance for her. For a blind horse. For the principle of the thing. Martha was the first to speak. "Well," she said briskly, "I suppose someone should take a look at that horse. Pete, you got any feed to spare?" "Got some in the truck," Pete said. Figured Sarah might need it. They came forward then, one by one, crossing onto Sarah's property. Martha climbed the porch steps and gave Sarah's arm a firm squeeze. "You did good," the older woman said quietly. "Jack would have been proud." Sarah couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. She just nodded and stepped aside to let them pass. The next weeks transformed Sarah's failing homestead in ways she couldn't have imagined. The morning after the confrontation, she woke to find old Tom and the Johnson brothers already at work repairing her fences. They wouldn't hear of payment, waving off her protests with gruff assurances that neighbors helped neighbors, conveniently forgetting that they hadn't been neighbors, not really, not for years. Pete Morales brought feed for Chance, good quality hay and grain that Sarah knew she couldn't afford. "Consider it a loan," he said with a wink. "Pay me back when you get your feet under you." But it was Martha who orchestrated the real change. The old woman had lived in this valley her entire life and knew every person, every grudge, every hidden kindness. She moved through town like a general deploying troops, and within days, Sarah's barn had a new roof courtesy of Danny Weaver and his father. Her well pump, which had been sputtering and failing, was repaired by a plumber from the next county over who happened to be Martha's nephew. Words spreading, Martha told Sarah one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the kind of direct honesty that was her trademark. "Story about you standing up to Vance, about that blind horse. People like it. Makes them remember there was a time when folks in this valley looked out for each other, before Vance bought up everything and everyone." "I didn't mean to start something," Sarah said, uncomfortable with the attention. "Maybe not," Martha agreed. "But you did. And now you gotta see it through." Vance hadn't been idle. His influence still ran deep, and he wielded it with surgical precision. The bank, which held the note on Sarah's property, suddenly demanded a payment schedule that had been flexible for years. The county inspector showed up to cite code violations on her barn. Never mind that half the barns in the county wouldn't pass inspection. Small acts of bureaucratic revenge, designed to squeeze and pressure and remind Sarah who really held power here. But for every move Vance made, the community countered. When the bank pushed, old Tom organized a fundraiser at the VFW hall. When the inspector came, the Johnson brothers showed up with materials and know-how to fix whatever needed fixing. It was a quiet war, fought in permits and payments and people showing up when they were needed most. And through it all, Chance and Scout became the unlikely symbols of resistance. Sarah watched them together with something close to wonder. Scout had taken to his role as guide dog with the seriousness of a sworn duty. He slept in the barn now, curled against Chance's flank. When Chance needed to move, Scout would make his soft singing sound, and the horse would follow. The dog led him to water, to food, to the corners of the paddock that Sarah had carefully cleared of obstacles. But it was more than just practical guidance. There was affection there, genuine friendship between two creatures who'd both been discarded and who'd found purpose in each other. Scout would nuzzle Chance's legs, and the horse would lower his great head to breathe in the dog's scent. Sometimes Sarah would find them standing together in the paddock, the horse's muzzle resting gently on Scout's head, both of them utterly content. The horse was gaining weight, his ribs no longer quite so prominent. His coat was developing a sheen it hadn't had before. And something else was happening too. Chance was learning to trust again. At first, he'd shied away from Sarah's touch, flinching at any unexpected sound. But gradually, day by day, he relaxed. He began to recognize Sarah's voice, her footsteps, the particular way she moved around him. One morning, Sarah woke to find Scout barking excitedly in the paddock. She rushed out, worried something was wrong, and found the dog racing in circles while Chance, impossibly, was trotting after him. Not fast and not far. Just a few yards before the horse stopped, breathing hard, ears swiveling to track Scout's position. But it was movement, real movement, born of something other than fear. Scout bounded back to the horse, his entire body wiggling with joy. and Chance lowered his head to bump gently against the dog's shoulder. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen since Jack died. She pressed her hand against her mouth, surprised to find she was crying, not tears of sadness, but of something she'd almost forgotten, joy. That afternoon, Martha brought news that was both good and troubling. "Vance is planning something," she said without preamble. "His ranch hands have been asking questions around town, wanting to know about property law, about what constitutes theft, about how to press charges." "He can't prove I stole Chance," Sarah said. "The fence was down. Horse could have wandered over on his own." "Proof isn't always the point," Martha said grimly. "Vance has the sheriff in his pocket. If he decides to push this, make an official complaint, you could be arrested. Even if the charges don't stick, the legal fees alone could bankrupt you." Sarah felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling on her shoulders. For a few weeks, she'd allowed herself to hope, to believe that community solidarity might be enough. But the reality was that Vance had power, real, legal, financial power, and she had nothing but a blind horse and a falling-down farm. "Let him try," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "We'll fight it." "We will," Martha agreed. "But Sarah, there's something else you should know. People are talking about more than just the horse now. They're talking about organizing, about standing up to Vance on other things. Land deals, water rights, the way he's been buying up family farms. You've given them something they haven't had in years, a reason to believe they can win." Sarah looked out her kitchen window at the paddock, where Scout was leading Chance in slow circles around the fence line. The dog's tail was high, his movements confident and sure. The horse followed with his head low, trusting Scout completely, learning the dimensions of his new home step by careful step. "I just wanted to save a horse," Sarah said quietly. "You did," Martha replied. "But you might have saved more than that. You might have saved this whole valley's soul." Winter came to Wyoming the way it always did, suddenly, brutally, without apology. The first hard freeze arrived in mid-November, turning the muddy ground iron-hard overnight. Snow followed, not the gentle dustings of early winter, but the heavy, relentless storms that could bury a man if he wasn't careful. Sarah had worried about Chance, about whether a blind horse could survive a Wyoming winter, but Scout seemed to have it handled. The dog would wake her before dawn when the snow was deep, and together they'd clear a path from the barn to the paddock, Scout testing the route first to make sure it was safe before leading Chance out for exercise. The community support that had seemed so strong in autumn began to thin as winter deepened. It wasn't malice. People had their own survival to worry about, their own animals to tend, their own struggles against the cold. The Johnson brothers stopped coming by as frequently. Old Tom's arthritis flared up in the cold, keeping him home. Even Martha's visits became less frequent as the roads grew treacherous. Vance, it seemed, was willing to wait. Let winter do his work for him. Let Sarah struggle alone with frozen pipes and heating bills and the constant, grinding effort of keeping herself and her animals alive. When spring came, if she lasted that long, he'd still be there, ready to buy her out for pennies on the dollar. But Sarah had survived 30 Wyoming winters. She knew how to ration firewood, how to keep pipes from freezing, how to make a can of coffee last twice as long as it should. What she hadn't expected was that Chance and Scout would teach her something new about endurance. The horse was thriving. Despite the cold, despite the hardship, Chance had gained weight and strength. His coat had grown thick and healthy. And more remarkably, he was learning to navigate his world with increasing confidence. Scout still guided him, but Chance was beginning to anticipate the layout of the paddock, to remember where the water troughs sat, where the fence corners were, where the gate opened. One afternoon in January, Sarah stood at the barn door watching them. The sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in days, turning the snow-covered plains into a blinding expanse of white. Scout was running circles in the paddock, burning off energy, and Chance was following, not cautiously now, but at a trot, his head high, his movements sure. As Sarah watched, Scout broke into a full run, streaking across the paddock in a blur of gray fur. And Chance, impossibly, wonderfully, galloped after him. It wasn't graceful. The blind horse's gait was slightly off, his head movements exaggerated as he tried to track Scout through sound and the vibration of paws on snow-packed ground. But it was a gallop, real and powerful, the kind of movement Chance hadn't been capable of months ago when he was starving in Vance's pen. Sarah found herself running too, out into the cold without a coat. Calling encouragement she knew the horse couldn't understand. Scout led Chance in a wide arc around the paddock, both animals moving with the kind of pure joy that transcended species, that spoke to something fundamental about freedom and trust and the simple pleasure of movement. They ran until Chance was winded, then slowed to a stop near where Sarah stood. The horse was breathing hard, his sides heaving, steam rising from his body into the cold air. Scout bounded over to Sarah, his tongue lolling, utterly pleased with himself. And Chance turned his head toward her, ears pricked forward, and for the first time since she'd taken him in, the horse walked to her without Scout's guidance. He walked straight to where she stood and lowered his head to her shoulder. Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart, the absolute aliveness of a creature who'd been left to die and had chosen to live instead. "You beautiful, stubborn fool," she whispered into his mane, and she was crying again. But these were good tears, clean tears, the kind that washed away old pain rather than adding to it. That night, the temperature dropped to 20 below zero. Sarah woke at 2 in the morning to Scout's frantic barking. She grabbed her flashlight and ran to the barn, terrified that something had happened to Chance, that the cold had been too much, that she'd lost him after all. Instead, she found the barn door standing open, blown loose by the wind. Snow had drifted inside, and Chance was standing in his stall, trembling but unhurt. Scout was pressed against the horse's legs, his body heat providing what comfort it could. Sarah wrestled the door closed and spent the next hour brushing snow off Chance and rubbing him down with old blankets. The horse stood patiently through it all, occasionally turning his head to nuzzle her shoulder, as if reassuring her that he was fine, that he'd survived worse than an open door and some snow. When she was satisfied that Chance was dry and warm, Sarah sat down in the hay, exhausted. Scout curled up next to her, and Chance lowered himself carefully to the ground, a process that involved much consideration and several false starts before the blind horse was confident he wouldn't hurt himself. Finally, he settled with a great sigh, his head resting near Sarah's lap. They stayed like that for a long time, woman and dog and blind horse, huddled together against the cold. Sarah thought about Jack, about how he'd loved nights like this, loved the brutal honesty of Wyoming winters that stripped away everything soft and left only what was essential. She thought about the farm, about all the ways it was failing and all the ways it was persisting. She thought about the community that had rallied around her and then, inevitably, returned to their own struggles. But mostly, she thought about the horse lying next to her, about Scout's unwavering devotion, about the way life persisted in finding cracks to grow through even in the hardest ground. "We're going to make it," she told them softly. "I don't know how, exactly, but we're going to make it." Scout's tail thumped once against the hay. Chance's ears swiveled toward her voice. And outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, but inside the barn, they were warm. The ice began to break in late March. Sarah heard it first in the middle of the night, the crack and groan of frozen earth beginning to thaw, of ice on the stock tanks fracturing, of the whole land shifting from winter's grip into spring's uncertain promise. It was a sound she knew well, had heard every year of her life, but this time it felt different. This time, it felt like victory. They'd survived. Against Vance's harassment, against the brutal winter, against the odds that had seemed insurmountable in those dark January nights when the cold pressed in and the firewood ran low and Sarah wondered if she'd wake up to find Chance frozen in his stall. But here they were, still standing, still fighting. The community began to re-emerge with the thaw. Old Tom showed up first, looking thinner than he had in autumn, but grinning widely. "Heard you made it through," he said simply. "Figured you might need help with spring repairs." The Johnson brothers came next, then Pete with feed and Martha with news. Vance had been quiet all winter, but he hadn't been idle. He'd bought out another 2 farms, families who'd gotten behind on their mortgages and had no choice but to sell. His empire was expanding while everyone else contracted, and there was talk. Always just talk, never quite concrete enough to act on. That he had plans for Sarah's land too. "He's been approaching your creditors," Martha told her bluntly, "offering to buy up your debts. If he owns your paper, he owns you." "Let him try," Sarah said. "I've been making my payments." "Verily," Martha pointed out. "One bad month, and he's got you." It was true, and Sarah knew it. The money from her late husband's life insurance was nearly gone. The farm produced almost nothing now, just enough to feed herself and the animals. She was living on credit and community charity, and both had their limits. But when she walked out to the paddock and saw Chance and Scout together, saw the way the horse had transformed from the terrified, starving creature she'd taken in to this strong, healthy animal who could navigate his world with confidence and even joy. When she saw that, she couldn't bring herself to care about debts and mortgages and Clay Vance's machinations. One warm afternoon in April, Sarah decided to expand Chance's world. The paddock was safe, familiar, but small. She wanted to give the horse more, wanted him to experience the kind of freedom that the vast Wyoming plains represented. She opened the gate to the larger pasture, an area she hadn't used since selling off most of her cattle. Scout understood immediately, darting through the gate, and then circling back to Chance. The horse hesitated at the threshold, ears swiveling, sensing the change but uncertain about it. "It's okay, boy," Sarah encouraged. "Scout's got you." The dog made his singing sound, and Chance took a tentative step forward. Then another. Then he was through the gate and into the pasture, and Sarah could see the moment when the horse realized how much space he had. His head came up, his nostrils flared, taking in all the new scents, and then, wonder of wonders, he began to run. Scout ran alongside him, not leading now but accompanying, and Chance stretched out into a full gallop across the greening grass. His mane flew, his tail streamed behind him, and he moved with a power and grace that seemed impossible for a blind animal. He ran like he was trying to outrun his past, like he was claiming his future with every stride. Sarah watched with her hand pressed to her mouth, hardly daring to breathe. The horse ran the length of the pasture, slowed, turned with Scout's gentle guidance, and ran back. He was learning the boundaries, mapping them in his mind, and with each pass, he grew more confident, more sure. This was what freedom looked like, Sarah thought. Not the absence of challenges or pain, but the presence of trust and space and the chance to choose your own direction. Chance was free now, not because his circumstances were perfect, but because he had the support and security to be himself, to run and stumble and get back up and run again. "Sarah!" The shout made her turn. Martha was hurrying across the yard, moving faster than Sarah had ever seen her move. The old woman's face was flushed, her eyes bright with something that looked like excitement. "You need to come to town," Martha panted. "Right now? There's someone you need to meet." "Who?" "Reporter from the Casper Gazette. My cousin's colleague. They want to do a story about you and Chance, about what happened with Vance." "Sarah, this could change everything." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want attention, didn't want strangers poking around her life, asking questions. But she looked back at the pasture, at Chance and Scout running together in the spring sunshine, and she thought about all the other animals like Chance, all the other people like herself who were being squeezed and pressured by men like Vance. "All right," she said. "Let's go." The reporter was a young woman named Jessica Torres, sharp-eyed and professional, with a camera bag slung over her shoulder and a recorder in her hand. She listened to Sarah's story with increasing interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions, taking notes on everything. "Can I see the horse?" she asked finally. They drove back to the farm in Sarah's truck. When they arrived, Chance and Scout were still in the pasture, the horse grazing peacefully while the dog dozed in the sun nearby. Sarah called Scout, and the dog immediately went to Chance, guiding the horse toward the fence. Jessica took photo after photo, Chance following Scout, the horse's clouded eyes, the scars on his flanks, the contrast between his current healthy condition and what Sarah described of his past. But the photo that would eventually run on the front page of the Gazette, the photo that would be picked up by the Associated Press and run in papers across the country, was the one Jessica took almost by accident. Scout had started running, and Chance had followed, and Jessica captured the exact moment when both animals were airborne, all four of the horses' hooves off the ground, Scout's ears flying, both of them silhouetted against the big Wyoming sky. It was a photo that captured everything: freedom, friendship, resilience, hope. "This is incredible," Jessica breathed. "Sarah, this story is bigger than you think. This isn't just about a horse or a feud with a rancher. This is about what happens when ordinary people stand up to power, about community and compassion and," she paused, struggling for words, "about the things that matter." The story ran 2 weeks later. Sarah didn't see it at first. She didn't get the Gazette, but Martha brought her a copy, along with a stack of phone messages from her answering service. The story had gone viral, as the kids said. There were interview requests from news stations, letters from animal rescue organizations, donations being sent to the general store because Sarah didn't have a proper address for such things. And there was one more thing. A letter from a lawyer in Cheyenne offering pro bono representation if Vance tried any legal action. I grew up on a ranch, the lawyer wrote. I know what men like Vance do to communities. I'd be honored to help you fight back. The attention was overwhelming. Sarah did a few interviews, always uncomfortable in front of cameras, always feeling like the story was bigger than her, like people were seeing something in her that wasn't really there. She was just a woman who'd taken in a starving horse, nothing more. But Martha saw it differently. You gave people something to believe in, she told Sarah over coffee one morning. In a world where it feels like the big guys always win, you showed that sometimes they don't. Sometimes the widow and the blind horse and the loyal dog can stand their ground and survive. People need that story, Sarah. They need it more than you know. Vance's response to the news coverage was predictable. He hired a publicist to issue statements about animal welfare on his ranch, about how he'd been trying to have the horse humanely euthanized and Sarah had stolen it, about how he was the real victim here. The statements were carefully worded, lawyered to death, and utterly unconvincing. The court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict, and Vance was losing. Protesters showed up at his ranch gates. The Rodeo Association, which Vance had been a patron of for years, quietly distanced itself. Several of his business partners found reasons to dissolve their arrangements. But Vance was a survivor. He'd built his empire through cunning and ruthlessness, and he wasn't about to let it crumble over a horse and some bad press. He shifted strategies, working behind the scenes, calling in favors, applying pressure where it would hurt most. The bank accelerated the payment schedule on Sarah's loan. The county revoked a variance she needed for her well. Her insurance premiums mysteriously doubled. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one technically legal, each one perfectly deniable, but the pattern was clear enough. Sarah fought back with the lawyer's help, but legal battles cost money she didn't have. The donations from strangers helped, but they weren't enough to cover everything. By midsummer, she was facing a stark reality. She might win the war for public opinion and still lose her farm. She was sitting on her porch one evening in late July, Scout at her feet, and the last light fading from the sky, when she saw the headlights coming up her drive. Multiple vehicles, moving in convoy. Sarah's hand moved to where the Winchester leaned against the porch rail, then stopped. Whatever this was, guns wouldn't solve it. The vehicles pulled up and men got out. Not Vance's men. These were townspeople, farmers and ranchers and store owners, maybe 20 of them. Old Tom led the way, walking with purpose despite his limp. We've been talking, Tom said without preamble. All of us. And we figure we've been letting you fight this battle alone for too long. We're forming a co-op, Pete Morales added. Pooling our resources, our labor, our equipment. And you're going to be part of it, Sarah. We'll work your land with ours, share the profits, share the losses. That way Vance can't pick us off one by one. Martha stepped forward, holding a sheaf of papers. We also took up a collection. Not charity, an investment. We're buying shares in your farm, Sarah. Making it legally complicated for Vance to take it from you. Lots of small owners are harder to bully than one big one. Sarah stared at them. These people who'd already given so much, who were offering to give more. I can't ask you to do this, she managed. You're not asking, Tom said. We're telling. This valley was built by people helping people, before Vance and his kind turned it into a war zone. We're going back to that, starting right here, right now. One by one, they handed her documents to sign, money to deposit, promises to keep. When they were done, Sarah's farm wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the community, protected by the collective will of people who decided that enough was enough. The next day, Sarah's lawyer filed papers creating the High Plains Agricultural Cooperative, with 37 members and Sarah's farm as its founding property. The legal maneuvering that followed was complex and aggressive, but the outcome was clear. Vance couldn't touch them, not without going to war with half the valley. He tried anyway. He sued, claiming fraud and conspiracy and a dozen other things. But the lawsuit dragged on, and with each hearing, more details of Vance's business practices came to light. the coercion, the bribery, the systematic destruction of competition. The judge, who wasn't in Vance's pocket despite his best efforts, grew less and less sympathetic. In the end, Vance didn't lose in court. He lost something more fundamental: control. The cooperative grew, adding members, buying equipment, negotiating contracts that no individual farmer could get. They weren't getting rich, but they were surviving, and that was victory enough. And through it all, Chance and Scout became the unofficial mascots of the resistance. People would drive out to Sarah's farm just to see them, to watch the blind horse run with his guide dog, to remember that seemingly impossible things were possible after all. Spring came again, as it always did, and with it came a different kind of hope. Sarah stood at the paddock fence, watching Chance and Scout in the early morning light. The horse was 10 years old now, grayed around the muzzle but strong and healthy. Scout was getting elderly too, moving a bit slower, sleeping a bit more, but still devoted to his charge. The farm was thriving in ways Sarah never could have imagined. The co-op had allowed her to diversify, to try new crops, to invest in improvements. She had hired hands now, young people who wanted to learn traditional farming, who were drawn by the story of a community standing together. The barn had a new roof, the fences were straight and strong, and the fields were green with promise. Vance was still around, diminished but not destroyed. He'd lost much of his power, much of his land, but he still had his big house on the hill and his pride. Sarah saw him sometimes at town council meetings or the feed store, and they'd nod to each other with the cold civility of old enemies who'd fought to a draw. But that morning, standing at the fence, Sarah wasn't thinking about Vance or the co-op or any of it. She was thinking about how far they'd all come, how much they'd survived. Scout barked, his voice thinner now, but still full of purpose. Chance's ears swiveled toward the sound, and the horse began to move. Not the cautious, uncertain movement of those early days, but with confidence and grace. Scout ran, and Chance ran with him, and they moved together across the pasture like they'd been doing it all their lives. Sarah watched them run, this blind horse and his aging guide dog, and she felt something she hadn't felt in the 5 years since Jack died: contentment. Not happiness. That was too simple a word for the complex mix of grief and joy and exhaustion and hope that filled her days. But contentment, the sense that despite everything, this was right, this was good, this was enough. The sun broke over the mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. Scout led Chance in one final run across the pasture, both of them silhouetted against the dawn, and Sarah thought about all the mornings to come, all the springs yet to arrive, all the people and animals who would find their way here, to this place where broken things learned to run again. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the co-op waking up, tractors starting, people calling to each other, the daily work beginning. It was the sound of community, of persistence, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things just by refusing to give up. Chance slowed to a stop near the fence, breathing hard but happy. Scout pressed against the horse's legs, and Chance lowered his head to rest his muzzle on the dog's back. They stood like that, two old friends watching the sunrise together, and Sarah knew that whatever came next, drought or flood, hardship or plenty, Vance's schemes or the bank's demands, they would face it together. She'd learned that lesson from a blind horse and a faithful dog, that the only way through darkness is together, with trust and patience and the willingness to keep moving forward even when you can't see where you're going. Sarah pushed off from the fence and walked back toward the house, toward the coffee that was waiting and the day's work that needed doing. Behind her, Scout barked once more, and Chance answered with a soft whinny, and the Wyoming morning stretched out before them, full of possibility and light.